This podcast is made possible by Vena.
Hello, I'm Amol Chaubal, CFO of Waters Corporation, and you're listening to CFO Thought Leader Podcast.
This is episode 871.
Our business is in, as I mentioned earlier, in a highly discretionary industry. Every indication for us is telling us it's going to be a high pressure on the consumer, high pressure economy, potentially a recession, who knows, but certainly people are pulling back, not extending. And so our biggest focus for the next 12 months is to say, how do we become as efficient as possible? How do we control expenses aggressively while not getting upside down on investments around planned sales that may not happen? So not making huge investments in inventory, not overstretching teams around new projects and CapEx, and really just focusing on the next 12 months.
Hi, it's Jack. On today's show, we speak with Jared Poff, CFO of Designer Brands. One of the unspoken truths about interim CFO roles is that they sometimes don't lead to an actual CFO role. For Jared Poff, who ultimately cleared all the hurdles as an interim chief, the job title ended up leaving a lasting impression. Back in 2015, Poff was recruited as a future CFO prospect by retailer DSW. If all went as planned, Poff could expect to enter the C-suite within the next 24 months. However, within months of Poff joining the company, the retailer's board put in motion a CEO change, a move that made some question whether a first-time CFO was necessarily a good match for a first-time CEO. Poff's interim title would become part of the solution. That story and much more after this. Managing multiple spreadsheets, disconnected data, numbers you just can't trust. Your finance team can't be the strategic partner your organization needs right now with obstacles like that getting in your way. Vena can change that. Vena brings people, processes, and systems together in a single collaborative analytical platform so you can drive connected business planning and better decision making. And it's the only native Excel complete planning platform built for Microsoft 365 with Power BI embedded. With Vena, your financial and operational data is always connected, and your teams are always armed with insights and time to focus on what matters most. So when the stakes are high and the margin for error low, plan with agility, plan with resilience, plan with Vena so you can be prepared for whatever comes next. Visit venasolutions.com/planningaces to learn more about how Vena will help you plan for anything. Hello, we're speaking with Jared Poff, CFO of Designer Brands. Jared, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
So, Jared, good to have you with us, and I'd love to have you look back for us. Again, we always begin here with the CFO taking a look back, but what we're trying to do is have them identify the more significant moments from their past where they feel they garnered the experience to do what they do, to lead a finance function, to be a finance leader. And anything come to mind for you?
So if you go all the way back to my undergrad days in college, obviously you have the big decision to make. Do you go accounting? Do you go finance? If you're interested in the industry in general, those are kind of the big two. I had decided after having taken courses in both, I was certainly more wired towards the finance side of the world. And I kind of looked at it as, if you have a line in the sand, accounting kind of looks at everything that happened from that line in the sand backwards and try to make sure that they've accounted for everything properly, that it's up to code, up to compliance. And finance in general was looking at that line in the sand forward to say, how are we going to finance future operations? Where's growth coming from? Things like that. And it was that forward side that that really I had a bigger passion for. I will tell you, as many people find out, many of those opening jobs, certainly back then, tended though to be more on the accounting side of the world. And so as I started out into the workforce, I found more opportunities on the accounting side, on the operational accounting side specifically. And so I had taken opportunities like that to get into companies. I'm based in Columbus, Ohio, which many people don't realize is a hotbed of corporate headquarters, especially for a city our size. In fact, there are 13 consumer-facing brands or companies with their home offices and headquarters here, and so it makes it somewhat a good place to grow your career by potentially even moving company to company. So I started in my current trajectory. I started at Abercrombie and Fitch at their corporate offices, also headquartered here, and it was in operational accounting. And I took that job knowing accounting wasn't my passion, but it was a way to get into a company I was passionate about, a brand I was passionate about. And while I was there, this was on their early growth stage. They were just eclipsing their first $1 billion in sales. Didn't have any of their other brands like Hollister or Gilly Hicks or even Abercrombie Kids yet. And they had one person in what is traditionally called corporate finance or treasury. And so I was asked to be that person's backup when they weren't going to be able to be in the office. And the first time I did that, I realized this is it. This was the delineation between what I was doing day to day in my operational accounting job. I was running a department called Sales Audit. I was also the lead of an ERP implementation. But getting to be that backup was something that resonated. The putting what I learned in school to action on a finance side really was passionate. And so I decided to go back to school in the evenings and get my MBA while I was working there full time, and then parlayed that into my future career growth aspirations, but knowing with much more clarity that it was that corporate finance, that M&A, that FP&A side that really was something that was starting to generate a passion for me. Not that I don't love and appreciate accounting and everything that accountants do, because I do, and you have to. It just wasn't my personal passion as much as finance was, and that was kind of the light bulb moment for me. Like, this is what it means to do that.
Excellent. Now, when you change jobs eventually from Abercrombie, what is it that you're looking for?
I was looking for something that would give me continued experience and exposure into that finance side of the world. So obviously there was an FP&A kind of component that I could have landed, or really something more on the capital market side, which is really, when you talk about a passion of a passion, that was a passion that I had. And one of the companies, not even one of the 13 brands I mentioned, but the largest company in not only Columbus, but all of Ohio, is a company called Cardinal Health. At the time, I think they were about $125 billion in revenue. They're headquartered there. They had an opening, and they were a highly acquisitive company, buying smaller medical or pharmaceutical related companies, rolling them up. That was part of their big growth plan. And as I mentioned, about $125 billion in revenue at the time. And they had an opportunity that I was able to approach because of my MBA that I had just acquired, that again was in the accounting side of the world, but I knew that as a business, they were heavy into the capital market side. So as I approached them, I made it clear to them, I think I'm qualified and can do this accounting role, but I am very attracted to your corporate finance, your capital markets area, and I'd like an understanding that that's where I'd like to steer my career. And I will tell you, they were actually very open to that. And while I took that job in accounting and actually was promoted in less than a year, which then kind of took me out of eligibility for internal transfers, an opportunity became open in their treasury and corporate finance area in less than that year's time. And because I had been open with them up front, they allowed me to go ahead and pursue that. And I did move into that. From that point on, I really never went back to solely working in the day-to-day accounting function throughout my career. I obviously did become controller, so I could get that experience before becoming CFO. But from a day-to-day accounting, I really have not gone back into that part of the business, but really parlayed that work at Cardinal into growing my career.
You've generalized a little bit when it comes to the treasury opportunity and what it was that appealed to you. I know it's the markets, but help us better understand the nature of your day-to-day activities and why you knew you were in the right spot.
Yeah, as geeky as it sounds, I have always been massively fascinated with the efficiency, while it's complex, the efficiency of the U.S. capital market, global capital markets, but led by the U.S. capital markets. And you learn this concept in undergrad, and then you see it play out where really you have a company like Cardinal that's needing to raise billions of dollars every single week to do acquisitions. And if it weren't for the capital markets, they would be needing to go and individually find savers, people who have dollars that are sitting in the sideline, and enter into individual contracts with each one to get their capital, to be able to use it and then deploy it for themselves. Massively inefficient. And to think that the capital markets, and I use quotation marks because that's a big broad thing, but the capital markets can bring that, can commoditize that so that the savers can easily get in connection with the borrowers and be able to do that with very low friction, very low cost. That had always been fascinating to me. I was one of the geeky kids, even as a teenager, who idolized that movie Wall Street, that had pictures of that hanging up in my room. And I loved the capital markets themselves. I loved the relationships of talking with bankers that were seeing deals they were making it possible for business to happen, for business combinations to happen. And so when I had an opportunity to kind of be that for a company that was very acquisitive, was very deal oriented, was always needing to find ways to raise money, that was very attractive. When I left Cardinal, I was running what was called then their structured finance and investments group. And that was way back in the day when very nuanced type of financing was permitted and allowed, such as off-balance sheet financing, synthetic leases, things that today really have been regulated out. Not that they were illegal; they've required a lot more transparency, and so they've become less efficient. But it was getting to work on those very creative, very unique types of things that were making it possible for Cardinal to move from $100 billion to $125 to $150 billion enterprise global. That's what was just fascinating to me. I love the transactions. I love the M&A work, and that you're in the heart of that.
Yeah. I just want to point out to the listeners that you were at Cardinal for 4 years. You're someone who's made an investment along the way, but you've made an investment of 8 years at Designer Brands. Go a step back. Big Lots, more than 10 years. So you really have made an investment over time. And I would imagine at Big Lots as well.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And it's, a lot of people, again, if they're any familiarity with Big Lots as a brand, and from what I said at Cardinal, given size, that was actually a hard leap to make, because you're going from $125 billion, $130 billion company to a $5 billion, still very large in its own right, but a much smaller company. And I was actually working at Cardinal for a lady, the treasurer of the company, but a lady who I would say, from a professional development standpoint, probably gave me my most the most development I've had in my career. Very career oriented, very strong practitioner of capital raising and capital markets. So before I even took the Big Lots opportunity, which they recruited me for, I approached her and said, look, I'm really conflicted. I don't know what to do here, but I respect your opinion, not as my direct manager, but as someone who has highly focused their career in something I'm interested in. Like, what would you suggest I do? And she said, obviously, I don't want to lose you. However, if I had the opportunity to go and be an officer in this field of a Fortune 500 company at the time in your career that you're at, like, I would have done that in a heartbeat. You can't pass that up. And so she really gave me the inspiration or the permission to go and take that opportunity, which I applaud her still to this day for doing that. A lot of managers might not. And it was absolutely the right one to do. But it was hard. I mean, just because of the size difference, the complexity difference, the sophistication difference, I wasn't sure it was going to be the right move. In hindsight, it absolutely was, but it was scary at the time.
When you do join Designer Brands back in 2015, are you still a few steps away from the CFO office, or what's your door of entry?
Yeah. So again, being heavily recruited there for about 2 years before I joined, I had known I'd known Roger Rollins, who is now the CEO. He actually just announced his retirement, so he'll be retiring in April. But he was not the CEO at the time. I knew the then sitting just had retired CFO. His name was Doug. And I had come to know the general counsel named Bill Jordan there because we all served on a philanthropic board together, and they had been recruiting me to come there. But up until the point that I decided to join, it had been primarily, we think there's big opportunity, but we want you to come. We want you to be treasurer, and we've got good growth aspirations. It's a roll-up story for our footwear industry. We think we're the leader, and this should be a good outcome. But it was still an if come. This is what we hope to happen. And at the time, they were only half the size of Big Lots. So I'd gone from Cardinal way down to Big Lots to a $2.5 billion enterprise and DSW. And they were only DSW then. They were not Designer Brands. And that's a clear distinction when we get into the company itself. They were just the shoe retailer that everyone knows. And so I had not really entertained it for those couple of years. Well, then they had a CEO and who had brought in their own CFO, and she had been tasked with setting up a direct grooming program so that they would have a succession plan for the CFO. That became attractive to me then, is that, okay, you're going to come in, you're going to be specifically groomed and formally, like, there will be no question. Everyone knows that that's why you're coming here, to be the next CFO. And along the way, I'd be able to check some of those boxes I still needed in that journey, like being a controller, like formally overseeing financial reporting and things like that. So she brought me on. I was treasurer from day one, headed up FP&A from day one, headed up what they were calling business development or M&A, because it was going to be a roll-up story. So they knew that they needed that. And I had that experience at Cardinal and at Big Lots. And then along the way, I was to be given controllership and tax and areas that I had not yet had exposure to for managing. That was in February that I joined. And it was supposed to be roughly about a 2-year grooming period. About 6 months into that first year, there was an unexpected CEO change. And Mike McDonald, who was the CEO, was out. Roger Rollins was elevated to CEO from an internal position. And Mary, it was voluntary on Mary's part, but she decided she wanted to pursue a different opportunity with Valvoline, who was spinning off public. And so I was made interim CFO 6 months into what was supposed to be about a two-year grooming period. And it was interim because Roger was a first-time ever CEO, and the board had said, while we are 100% bought in, you're going to be a CFO for us someday. We're not 100% comfortable that a first-time CEO should be partnered with a first-time CFO, as tight as that relationship needs to be, and that type of thing. So I sat in that interim role for about 6 months. The absolute most grueling 6 months of my career, outside of maybe COVID. I was treasurer, I was controller, and I was CFO, because I couldn't hire either of those other positions in case I didn't get to keep this job. I needed something to go back to. And so what is now filled by 3 very senior executives, I was filling for myself for 6 months. And you were living an interview every day. Like any wrong decision was a reason for them not to give you the job. So it was very, very grueling. But I would do it again in a heartbeat. It made you talk learning by fire. You learn everything. They interviewed 70 people, but they considered 70 people. I don't know how many they ended up interviewing, but ended up getting the nod. And like you said, I've been there for years. I mean, since 2015, and very, very, very happy with everything that's progressed there.
Well, that's a nice overview for us. Certainly, we've had guests before who had found the interim role on the way to the CFO office. Never realize how clearly that has to be a difficult position, given, as you mentioned, you can't really hire people. You're interim. Who would want to work for someone who's interim either? You're not going to be able to bring in top talent. It's just doesn't work. Anyway, interesting the way you've illustrated for us. Great, much greater clarity. Thank you. So let's find out about Designer Brands. It is publicly traded. It's go back in time for us, and if you wouldn't mind too, just how old a company is it, and come forward. Tell us about this company.
Yeah, we just celebrated our 25th anniversary. I think it was last year, and the way it started, it was a closeout shoe retailer called Designer Shoe Warehouse, DSW. Most people know of Designer Shoe Warehouse. It is a category killer in women's dress footwear. Depending on the categories, the finite category, it's number one or number two in market share. And their original business model truly was closeouts. They would be open 3 days a week, and then the other 4, they'd be out in the markets buying closeouts. They'd bring them to their single store in Dublin, Ohio, just outside of Columbus, leave them in the pallets, and then people would come, mostly business women or people who needed dress shoes would come and just go crazy, waiting in lines to get in and buy these closeout shoes. Over the years, as stores opened and you needed a more consistent supply, they obviously became more in line, where they're just every day buying from the big brands, and that really that was their growth. And so we opened up stores coast to coast, became about 550 stores and a couple $1 billion in sales, and again, massive domination in the market for women's dress and seasonal. So fall, it's the boots, and then sandals in the spring, and that was their claim to fame. If you fast forward to about 2016, 2017, we really started looking at the competitive landscape, and this is happening in any category, but absolutely in footwear. It's easily webifiable. So like DTC, the brands going direct, is massively easy in footwear. It's easily shipped, easily shopped online, and so you started seeing the competitive advantage that DSW had vis-a-vis their other retail competitors start to get eroded, not by other retailers, but by the brands. All of a sudden, Nike becomes a huge competitor, not a vendor anymore. And Adidas and UGG and Birkenstock and everyone like that starts growing their DTC business at the expense of their traditional wholesale business. And so our CEO, Roger, at the time called it a melting ice cube. Everyone that's just a brand-to-brand retailer in a highly webifiable industry is just an ice cube sitting outside of the freezer, and it's just a matter of how big your ice cube is before you're eventually gone. And so we decided we had to get farther up that brand curve and start getting in control of our own brand destiny and not just be a retailer for someone else's. So that's what we did, and we actually led an entire. We already had a couple private labels, but we led an entire analysis around building out our own. So what it would take to open up a China sourcing office and do all those factory relationships and hire designers and do brand building and marketing and all that kind of stuff. And along that journey, there were a couple opportunities that came up to acquire that. One was a brand that had high relevance to our consumers but had fallen on hard times. That was a brand called Nine West. We went after that. It was in a bankruptcy proceeding, so it was highly competitive, and we just got outbid. We couldn't make that happen. But almost the day that we lost that bid, an even bigger, more relevant brand to us became available, and that was the Vince Camuto brand. And so Vince Camuto, who actually was one of the founders of Nine West way back in the day, had passed away, but he had developed a really large following, a big wholesale business, and a top class design and sourcing infrastructure. And his company, after his passing, was being sold. And so we were able to close that transaction and immediately became still a big retailer, but also a design and brand builder. And externally, we were now selling to some of our biggest retail competitors, Nordstrom, Macy's, Dillard's, people like that. But then also we instantly verticalized some of the biggest brands already being sold inside of DSW. So when you think of we now get to buy it at true factory cost, we're not even paying the wholesale margin. We get to do that. You get the benefits of being an Abercrombie, but yet you still have a wholesale business attached to it. And so we really pivoted the business and said our growth is hinged on brand building. We will continue to be a dominant retailer and have select retail partnerships with other national brands that we don't own. But our growth as a company is going to be around building out our own brands, finding distribution inside and outside of DSW, and really going after it that way. And so in addition to that, we bought our the biggest shoe retailer in our space up in Canada. So we became a global North American retailer, and then bought the brand company. And so because of all of that, we changed the name of the company to Designer Brands. And we've got two retail segments, the DSW in the US and Shoe Company up in Canada. And then we have our brand portfolio, which is truly a wholesale business as well as a design and sourcing for our own retail.
Yeah, so a very nice overview for us. Thank you for that. Just curious, just related to capital structure, when did the company go public originally?
That was, I should know that. I think it was, I don't know, 20 some years ago. Maybe it's been a while.
It's been a while. It goes back to the early 2000s, perhaps. Okay. So when you stepped in finally to the CFO office, though, what was the chapter? What was your business at hand that had to be taken care of? Was there acquisitions? Was there, were you trying to more tightly integrate all of what you were just describing for us?
Yeah, we had not yet. When I first took the CFO role, we had not yet bought Camuto. We had half bought our Canadian operations. We did that in a two-step acquisition with a PE firm. And then we exercised in 2018, we exercised our option to buy out the other half. So we did have a component of integrating and understanding that Canadian piece, but it really was two things: ensuring we had continued efficiency gains and acceptable, although modest, growth on traditional retail. So, being able to put up 1% to 2% year over year competitive store or comparable store sales had to still be done while increasing margin and leveraging expenses. So that was key one. But more importantly, it was really around how to strategically go after this upstream acquiring of business. Again, whether it was going to be build or buy, that was one of my biggest challenges was, how do we do that? And so we did start a couple big analyses, not just start, we finished some greenfield analyses where we said, okay, this is what it would be. How would we stand up the organization? That took a lot of time, a lot of scenario modeling, things like that. And along the way, we actually did buy a couple small companies. We bought a company called eBuys, or Shoe Metro was their trade name, but the company's name was eBuys. They were a footwear reseller on Amazon and eBay. They were actually eBay's largest footwear company. And we thought that was a great way to start getting access to some additional customers. What we didn't learn till after the fact was there were many of our key brands that were huge to our business at DSW who were not okay showing up on eBay and Amazon, and therefore held us hostage with our business at DSW if we allowed eBuys after we bought them to still sell their brands on eBay and Amazon. And it unfortunately ended up being the undoing of that transaction. I mean, we had to shut it down after we bought it because we couldn't risk losing Nike inside of our assortment at DSW at the time. We ultimately ended up losing Nike just because Nike, as I was mentioning, said, I'm getting out of wholesale and I'm going into more DTC, and we don't have Nike today in our assortment and are doing just fine. But at the time, that wasn't a risk we could take. So there was some of that, but it was more around strategically laying the groundwork for how we were going to go upstream, how we were going to get further into that brand building part. And like I said, it was some starts and stops with building our own, and then a failed attempt at one, and a successful acquisition on another. By 2018 is when we made those.
You mentioned how being an interim CFO for 6 months was one of the more challenging times next to COVID, and that's sort of where we're at, I think. The whole COVID experience given the business that you're in, what would you share with us as you look back and reflect now on the early days? Curious what you thought was coming, and when when the reality of what it was going to be arrived, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, it's so crazy to think back on that now. So while we are a public company, we continue to have our majority voting owner is our founding chairman. The chairman is our founding father. His name is Jay Schottenstein. He also is the CEO of American Eagle Outfitters, the big brand there. Value City Furniture has a big business with Albertsons, the grocery store, and things like that. So he conducts every year pre-COVID what he calls his best practices conference, where he brings the senior leaders of all of his companies together for a week-long session of idea sharing, what's working, what isn't working, and then hearing from outside experts on various things. And it was best practices of 2020, which would have been in February, usually right around Valentine's Day. We were all there. We had all started, saying, okay, what could this possibly mean for our businesses? And everyone, I mean, it was more, you had American Eagles, and this may not be right, but American Eagles saying, we think it's going to last X long, and we might have to, trim some hours or cut. And we say, well, we think it's going to last this long, and we don't think we're going to have to close any stores. None of us had any inclination of what was about to hit us in reality. And so, you fast forward just 6 weeks after we had that meeting, and DSW has no stores open in the United States. American Eagle has no stores open in the United States. So just a very, very different perspective than what we had just 6 weeks prior. And I mean, for us, it was so impactful on multiple ways. First and foremost, we are a massively discretionary item, footwear and dress footwear at that. So when any local jurisdiction was deciding what do we allow to stay open and what don't we never made the list of what was allowed to stay open. So instantly, while we had a big website, it still was only about 20% of our overall revenue. So instantly, we lose 80% of our $3 billion of revenue, and I still have 16,000 employees that are expecting a paycheck, and every expense that is not tied to sales is still being incurred. So it immediately became cash preservation. It became what do we do for the health and safety of our employees, for protecting our consumers who eventually will come back to us, and then what do we do for the health of our business? And we pulled back, as you would imagine, on every expense. We had to furlough almost 80% of our workforce. We told all of our landlords, we're not, as long as our stores aren't open, we're not paying rent. We will make it up when we can reopen, but we can't give you cash right now. And they all worked with us very well. They knew it wasn't a credit problem. And then, it really turned into fundraising. And so we raised $700 million that year. And we were a company that really had no long-term debt. And so we raised $700 million. We were able to get that done. We generated about a $500 million operating loss that year. So just a huge loss, but made it through. And then fast forward to 2021 and the recovery, had the best year ever in corporate history ever. We paid off the entire term loan that we had taken out, and really everything opened back up, and people had a really high demand for footwear. So that was great. But it was interesting. Another interesting thing I'll point out, which I would have never thought about, we were seeing on our business of footwear, there was market share being had by people simply because they sold things other than footwear. And so if you think of Target and Walmart and places like that, they were allowed to stay open and they have a footwear department. So while we were kind of forced out of the market, we were forced to cede market share to people because they happened to sell groceries, and people were still buying shoes there, and nothing you could do about it. But you talk about when your hands are tied behind your back, it just feels so bad to have to go to a fight and not be allowed to swing. And that's what was happening. So it was very different.
Right. Interesting perspective. That's useful. Thank you. Wanted to, we always ask about lines of sight. And again, we've had quite a few tech players on the show recently, I guess, tech CFOs. It's refreshing to speak to someone who's not necessarily right in that tech realm, not manufacturing software. Your lines of sight, are they, do you feel your visibility is increasing? Are you collecting data as much as we hear from these technology companies that sort of run on it already? Your world, I would think, is not as intense, but what would you tell us about it in terms of your lines of sight and your ability to have data inform your decision making?
Yeah, I would say it certainly is a huge appetite always. I mean, an insatiable appetite to get more data to make decisions. I would tell you, obviously, from a product standpoint, we aren't as technologically reliant on data to develop that footwear today, but it's evolving. When you look, it was already this way, but coming out of COVID, comfort features inside of footwear are now being demanded in footwear that normally wouldn't. So even in your high heels and things that were way more about fashion and looks, they're now being demanded that they've got a comfort feature in, and that is solved through technology. It is solved through things that allow you to infuse them without them being seen. If you went to CES and a whole contingent of designer brands was just there last week, they will tell you there's a bunch of technology around 3D printed componentry for shoes, specifically for custom fits inside of someone else's shoe. But you can get scanned, they'll print it for you, slip it inside your shoe, and it dramatically changes how you feel inside that footwear. And how do you do that? So from a product side, absolutely, it's increasing the way we use technology. I will tell you, as we became a brand builder, having access to data around the consumer is massively important. And that's data, unlike most other brands that we compete with from a brand standpoint, we have the luxury of having 30 million VIP program members inside of our DSW shop that can feed us all kinds of data we use for product development on our brand side. Most brands don't have that huge retail and consumer component that we do. But for the brands that we distribute outside of DSW, we are always looking for more and more consumer data. What's changing? Where are they shopping? Are they no longer going to Macy's, or where are they going? Is it now Anthropologie, somewhere like that? And so that is something we can't get enough of, and we're building as much data lakes and pipes that we can to constantly get that data so we can access it.
Forward, I do want to ask you about talent, sort of related to that COVID question. Again, you had some tough decisions, perhaps. I don't know if there was a layoff or how you managed your talent, at least in the retail environment or the component, that business. one would imagine there was some tough decision making that had to be made. We've since come out of COVID, and I'm wondering, as a finance leader of this company, do you look at talent differently? Are you share with us your talent mindset today?
Yeah, we absolutely are looking at talent differently. I would say I always feel like we've prided ourselves in our culture and how we show up in the eyes of our employees, and then that's evidenced by low turnover and things like that. However, the realities of COVID meant I had to furlough 80% of the people. So that means I can't pay you, and I don't know when I can bring you back, but I hope I can. We did. We brought back most everyone. But allowing us to be comfortable with change has allowed us to continue to retain our good talent and acquire new and better talent. And as a great example of that, in 2020, I unfortunately, through health reasons, lost my head of internal audit, and there was not the caliber of replacement I was able to find in Columbus, which normally would have been where you needed to have that team reside. I convinced the audit committee, which technically internal audit reports to, even though the CFO manages it on a day-to-day basis. I convinced the audit committee to allow me to hire that person as a remote hire, because we had already proven you can work from anywhere and do a lot of our job. And it was a trial basis, but they gave me the permission to do that, and that allowed me to poach someone from at that time it was from Walmart, which had a huge international compliance structure, which we knew we needed as we were becoming this brand builder, much bigger retailer. And I would have never been on the radar because they were not going to move from Arkansas up to Ohio. But I hired this lady, absolutely the best hire in that role that the company's ever had. The audit committee, hands down, said it was the right test to do. They would do it again. Since then, she's built out her entire team with not a single nexus between them or to Columbus, but it has allowed her to bring in talent that is very diverse and very much more skilled than what you can get by just fishing in that small pool. And so we have deployed that across not just finance, but across most of designer brands, and really allows us to look and act and retain talent very differently. So head of stores that again would have typically been in Columbus now resides in Hilton Head, but still can do her job from anywhere, and it makes her more enduring to DS or to designer brands than should we say she had to move to Columbus. So I think there has been a change in a good way.
Well, great insight there for us. Thank you. It's a familiar scenario. We've been hearing it, but very interesting in your part of the world as well. So thank you for that. We're going to jump to what we refer to as our finance strategic moment question. And this is where we ask finance leaders to share a moment of insight that they experienced along the way in their careers. Might have been 20 years ago, might have been last week, but it's where you saw something because of your finance leadership, your finance senior finance role, where you could look into the numbers and detect what was coming, whether it was a risk or an opportunity, and respond to it. What comes to mind when we ask for a finance strategic moment?
Yeah, it's funny. One, when we were having our pre-discussion, you kept using the word storytelling, and then two, you just used the word looked into the numbers. I will tell you, when I think of the finance strategic moment for me, it was more around the difference between being the CFO versus even being an SVP of finance, where you're still very much in the operational piece of running a finance department. You're the controller, you're the treasurer. And I remember that I got the interim role. I had this massively huge binder, which I had memorized inside and out, but I mean, it was huge because I was going to my first board meeting. I had no idea what I was going to be asked. So I knew every number. I was able to flip to wherever. And we're coming back from that meeting, and the CEO tells me, he says, I never want you to bring that binder anywhere again. So if you need it, find a technological solution, but I don't want to see that. You're not showing up the way that a senior CFO should. And then he told me, and I don't want you using a number when you are presenting. if a CFO is using numbers, they are not telling the story. He goes, you've got people who tell the numbers. I need a partner. I need an executive who's going to be storytelling. Now they're going to wrap around, what this means financially for the business, but to 90% of the business, they don't understand the numbers anyway, but they need to understand the impact of the numbers. And so I said, you want me to be a CFO and never quote a number when I'm talking? And he said, absolutely. That is what I count as success. And it really was a pivot for me when I said, that is the difference between, being an operational finance executive and being a senior sort of CFO executive. You really are trying to convince people. You're trying to assure people. You're trying to make them move in the direction you need them to make. And when 90% of them are not numbers-oriented people, you're not going to do that with a number. And so I would tell you, I think if you were to ask anyone inside of Designer Brands, when I give up and give my monthly presentations to leadership or my quarterly presentations to the whole company, they actually look forward to it. I've got a little gimmick where I always tie something back to an 80s movie or an 80s song that's just a decade I loved. And so that's always a connection I have. But it can tell a financial story without, scaring them with a number. And that was it. It's way more about storytelling and influencing once you're a CFO than it is around, seeing a number and trying to get people to appreciate that number.
Hello and welcome to 60-Second Stories from CFO Thought Leader. Back in 2013, Stephen Mitchell had been working only a few months for Irish telecom giant, Eircom, when an enticing job offer upended his weekly commute from the United Kingdom to Dublin. It seems Eircom's CFO was prepared to appoint Mitchell corporate finance director. It was an appointment that would require Mitchell to oversee the company's investor relations, treasury, merger and capex functions. However, that was not all. Mitchell's appointment came just as Eircom was making the business case to roll out a 4G network across Ireland. Besides his new functional responsibilities, it was clear Mitchell was now expected to rally his finance team and bring forth the financial insights required to move forward the business case for 4G. That story and much more on episode number 864 featuring Stephen Mitchell, CFO of Redgate Software. Remember, the future of finance is listening.
We're going to jump to our mentoring round where I ask you several quick questions intended to inform and inspire future finance leaders. We're wondering, when you first took on the role, again, we touched on, you were in the interim role, and then you stepped into the official CFO office and responsibilities. If you could go back in time, that first 30 days, that first 60 days you were a CFO, and just give yourself a piece of advice, what would you tell yourself?
I would say you need to understand exactly what I just said about this. Your job is more around influencing people than it is being right about a number. Not that you can be wrong about the number, you can't, but that's the expectation. All along your career journey, as you're climbing the ladder, it is about proving you can be right about the number most often. Your accuracy is always right. You're the quickest. There are things like that. You're not as concerned about influencing people. And it takes a while to understand when that needs to be your biggest job. And so I would say one of the biggest things I noticed tangibly different is when you are not at the ELT, the executive leadership team, you are the constant recipient of this is where we're going and this is what I need you to do. When you are on the ELT, you're the ones having to make the decisions. Like, where are we going? You're plotting it. This is where we're going. You're doing it in tandem with your other ELT peers, but you're making that decision. And it's such a different perspective when no one's telling you that that's where we're going. And so I would have tried to convince myself that was the difference earlier, and not still show up at an ELT meeting and try to prove to them I was the one that had the quickest accuracy and able to do that. It's more around, let's talk as peers around what we need from this business.
We always like to ask our guests to reflect a little on the personal side for us. We're wondering if there's a personal habit that you have or part of a daily routine. This might be outside of work. In fact, it might be something that a family member rather than a colleague would point out, someone who knows you well. Anyway, do you have a personal habit or a routine that you're known for, something that sets you apart perhaps from most of your colleagues at work?
Yeah, I have always been a musician. I actually was a musician as a kid. Played piano, played saxophone, played lots of things. Have always had a huge passion for music, and I continue to this day to play in a garage band that I have been a part of for 25 years. And we've got many different, actually some very senior executives from different industries that are all part of this band. We all started early on in entry level jobs, and grew our careers. But being able to have a release that for whatever period of time, once a month at a gig, whatever it is, you can unplug. There is no status. There's nothing you're trying to prove. You're just trying to entertain and have fun. It really, I find it needed and refreshing, because it can be very high burden, high pressure to always be on. And when you're a CFO, you are always on. There is no downtime. There are emergencies that come up all the time. And so knowing you've got a gig coming up in 6 weeks, or you're going to see all your band brothers again, some of which are retired and don't even live in the state, but we all get together still. That's a release. And I think it's important that people find a release, whether it can be golf, it can be whatever, but you're unplugged. You're not talking business. You're not talking status. You're not talking egos. It really is a common connection that is just for fun and entertainment.
Would you have a book recommendation for us? Doesn't have to be a business book. Might be something you escape with. Anything?
Yeah, one that I really surprisingly stumbled on that I love. This was several years ago. It was called The Children of Men. And it's a little bit of a dark book. It's about the human race becomes sterile. However, it really is a book about humanity and what people really are yearning for. And as you move into leadership roles, any job, any industry, it all really is about storytelling and about motivating and comforting people. And you read this book and you realize, even in something as crazy and dark as that, that's what it was. They provided three things as a society, the leadership, even though it was a dying society. They provided, I think it was freedom of fear, freedom of want, and freedom of boredom. But by doing that, they kept people at a comfort level and engaged in doing this together in a peaceful way. And I won't disclose the end if you want to go read it. But it was really interesting about human dynamics and leadership, even though it wasn't a leadership book. It's obviously fictional, but I got a lot.
Very, very intriguing. You've intrigued, I'm sure. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Well, we are at our final question where we ask you to look forward finally, the next 12 months. And we'd like to know what your priorities are as a finance leader. What are those priorities for the next 12 months for you?
Yeah, our business is in, as I mentioned earlier, in a highly discretionary industry, and every indication for us is telling us it's going to be a very high pressure on the consumer, high pressure economy. Not potentially a recession, who knows, but certainly people are pulling back, not extending. And so, our biggest focus for the next 12 months is to say, how do we become as efficient as possible? How do we make sure that we control expenses aggressively while not getting upside down on investments around planned sales that may not happen. So not making huge investments in inventory, not overstretching teams around new projects and CapEx, and really just focusing on the next 12 months. We think that there's some pressure, especially discretionary consumer pressure coming.
Jared Poff, thank you for joining us on CFO Thought Leader.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
Hello, Thought Leader listeners. As you have perhaps already heard, or even seen. We're now featuring the career lessons and moments of strategic insight shared by our CFO guests as thought leader videos. You can now find these videos on our blog at cfothoughtleader.com and, of course, our newsletters, but also on LinkedIn. If you haven't already, please go ahead and follow our CFO Thought Leader LinkedIn company page, and you'll be certain not to miss a single Thought Leader video debut. CFO Thought Leader, the #1 thought leadership platform exclusively for and by CFOs. As always, thank you for listening.